Want to make a podcast? Spotify's got a platform that lets you make one super easily, then distribute it everywhere and even earn money, all in one place for free. It's called Spotify for Podcasters, and here's how it works. Spotify for Podcasters lets you record and edit podcasts right from your phone or computer, so no matter what your setup is like, you can start creating today. Then you can distribute your podcast to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are heard. Video podcasts are also available on Spotify, and when you want to take conversations with your fans to the next level, Q&A and polls are the best way to get them talking. With Spotify for Podcasters, you can earn money in a variety of ways, including ads and podcast subscriptions, and best of all, it's totally free. I highly recommend you give it a try. Download the Spotify for Podcasters app or go to www.spotify.com/podcasters to get started today.
Big Ten, Big Ten, Big Ten, football talk. Big Ten, Big Ten, Big Ten, football talk. Big Ten, Big Ten, Big Ten, football talk. Big Ten, Big Ten, Big Ten, football talk.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Big Ten Football Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Zach Guggenheim. We are going to talk about the news that dropped today, or if you're, by the time this podcast drops, it's yesterday, but dropped today about the new schedules as the Big Ten welcomes USC and UCLA into the conference. If you like the podcast, make sure to like, follow wherever you get your podcast. Make that Apple, Google, Spotify. Make sure you check out the podcast, subscribe to it, leave a review, follow us on Instagram and Twitter at the Big Ten Football Talk handle. Send me an email, bigtenfootballtalk@gmail.com. I said we were going to start producing more content, as the summer started to progress. And there had been rumors of the schedule dropping in the near future. And I think a number of things that came out today, most of them I don't think were that surprising, but there are a couple shockers in here. But this isn't just about schedules, but it's the implications for the future of the conference. And so the big one, as the schedule dropped today, no more divisions. That was wildly speculated that there would be no more divisions. We had heard from many higher ups that they weren't going to do divisions. Other conferences had specified that they were nixing divisions, the SEC being the most notable, that they're sticking to 8 games and 16 teams, and I think they're getting rid of divisions. The Big Ten, 9-game conference schedule, 3 non-conference games, no divisions, which means that the kind of the logjam in the East that Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, Michigan State at times, it's no longer a logjam to get to the Big Ten championship game. And so you can see a rematch of Ohio State, Michigan, or Michigan, Penn State, or, if it turns out this way, USC, Wisconsin, something like that. And so it really does, in some ways, help the conference title picture. It's going to be the 2 best teams, at least the 2 best in terms of record. Now, I think there's some things about that we'll talk about later. But the reality is you're going to get a lot more variation in the Big Ten title game. And you're going to get probably some better matchups, right? So like this past year even, and I don't mean this to any disrespect to Purdue, but Purdue was not the second best team in the conference this year. It was Ohio State. And so you would have gotten a rematch of Ohio State, Michigan in the Big Ten championship game. And with the 4-team playoff, it probably would have knocked Ohio State out of the playoff if they lost again. If they ended up beating Michigan, it probably wouldn't have mattered. They probably both would have been in. One thing to note is that this is happening in 2024. And so any concern about missing the playoff as the second best team in the Big Ten and having to play a championship game kind of is moot, because in 2024, they're going to a 12-team playoff. So in a lot of ways, and I was listening to Cleveland.com's Buckeye Talk, Doug Lesmerises, Stephen Means, Nathan Baird. Those guys are awesome. You should definitely listen to them. But they were making the point that the Big Ten title game is probably going to become more of a seeding game than it will be a get into the tournament game. And what I mean by that is, remember, the top 4 conference champions will get buys in a 12-team playoff. So, in a sense, unless if the Big Ten has a really down year, which, looking at the landscape, like the Pac-12's in trouble. There's rumors that the teams are leaving the Pac-12. The Big 12's in trouble because, like, Cincinnati's their third best team at this point, and that doesn't mean much. The ACC, there's teams poking around, possibly leaving the ACC. It's looking more and more like the SEC and the Big Ten are the 2 big conferences. And so, in a lot of ways, the Big Ten, that Big Ten championship game is becoming a game about seeding for the college football playoff. So that's just an important data point. If you're sitting there thinking, oh gosh, the division thing really protected Ohio State this past year, and now it may not protect, you're probably not going to need it to protect in terms of getting into the dance in future years. Because remember, we're going from 4 teams to 12 teams. So with all that in mind, I want to get to some of the details of this and then maybe some takeaways. So the first thing is this. They announced that each team, that the intention of the schedule that came out is that in every 4-year cycle, they want every team in the Big Ten to play each other at least twice in a home-and-home scenario. So what I mean by that is Ohio State or Penn State or Purdue, every single team would play all the other 15-member institutions at least once at home and at least once away in the next 4 years, so 2024 to 2027. In that, every 2-year cycle, or every 2 years, each team plays 3 teams home and away in the next 2 years. And that includes protected rivals. So each team gets 3 programs that they'll play twice in 2 years. So, for instance, Illinois is playing Purdue and Northwestern home and away in 2024 and 2025. And they play those teams. Illinois plays Purdue and Northwestern because they're protected rivals. And then the third team is Ohio State, where they get away in 2024 and they get home in 2025. And so those are the 3 teams that they get both in 2024 and 2025. Everybody else, they play once in 2024 or 2025, and then they wait to play them again sometime in the next 2 years. So hopefully that makes sense. So that's one data point. The other thing is, not every team has the same amount of protected rivals. So I'll just go down this list for a minute. Illinois, it's Purdue and Northwestern. They get 2. Indiana, it's Purdue. And that's it. The old Oaken Bucket. That's it. Iowa has 3. It's Nebraska, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, which makes sense that they're, Wisconsin and Minnesota are traditional rivals. Nebraska, they kind of manufactured as they came into the conference. Maryland is Rutgers. In some senses, it makes sense because they came in together. Michigan gets 2 with Michigan State and Ohio State. Michigan State, it's just Michigan. It's just Michigan. Minnesota, it's Iowa and Wisconsin. Nebraska, it's just Iowa. Northwestern, it's just Illinois. Ohio State, interestingly enough, is just Michigan. And I have some thoughts behind that. But Purdue, they get Illinois and Indiana. Rutgers, obviously just Maryland. UCLA gets USC. USC gets UCLA. Wisconsin gets Minnesota. And Iowa And you might be thinking, wait, he forgot a team. No, I didn't forget a team. The Big Ten forgot a team. Penn State has zero. They have zero protected rivals. And I'll start there. I think Penn State fans, and if I don't mean this in a mean way, but I think sometimes Penn State fans can have a fragile ego and feel like the conference is against them. This does not help this. This does not help. And if I'm honest, I can understand it, but it just feels like a terrible way for Tony Petitti to start his reign as the Big Ten commissioner. And I don't know if this was his fault or if it was the ADs or what, but to not give them anybody protected, it feels like it's just another way. It's another perceived slight for Penn State. Now, before I go any further with that, I think there are a few things to consider. I do think it would have been a tough sell for Ohio State's protected rivals, who they play every year, be Michigan and Penn State. Because at this point, they are the top. Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State are the top three teams in the Big Ten. No offense to USC. USC lost to Tulane. They got killed by Utah. Like, USC is not on the same level. I don't care how great Lincoln Riley is and how great Caleb Williams is. They're not on the same playing field right now. Like, they're just not. And having said that, I think it would have been a stretch to have Ohio State play Michigan and Penn State every single year when they are the top three teams right now. And historically, they'll be one of the top four teams in the conference from year to year, right? Certainly there'll be years where Wisconsin and UCLA and Michigan State rise up. But the reality is Penn State is one of the top four brands in the conference. And you're going to have Ohio State play Michigan and Penn State every year. Same goes for Penn State and Michigan, right? Like, Michigan already has Ohio State and Michigan State. No offense to Penn State, but both Ohio State and Michigan's rivalries that they had before Penn State entered the conference are more important and more valuable in the grand scheme of things. And so I have a hard time. I can see why they didn't put Penn State there in those games. And that makes me have a hard time when Penn State fans say this is unfair. Having said that, I think this could have been a really helpful way for Penn State to begin a new rivalry, right? Like, I think there could have been a natural way to connect Penn State maybe to Nebraska, because it would have made sense from an entry point way, right? Nebraska, Penn State. Penn State entered in the 90s, then Nebraska was the next team to enter in. I get that Nebraska hasn't tangled with Penn State much, but I think from a historical perspective, that would have made sense. I think they could have continued Penn State, Michigan State. Although that would have been tough for Michigan State just from a competitive nature. I think they could have done Penn State, USC, because no offense to UCLA, but out of USC and UCLA is the weaker program. USC and Penn State are much more like equals than USC, UCLA is. But I still think you'd want to protect USC, UCLA, obviously. But other than those three, every other team trying to set up a rivalry with Penn State, it doesn't really make sense. Maryland had a lot of bravado trying to, start something with Penn State. But I think Penn State fans would have felt disrespected if the rivalry was Penn State, Maryland, or Penn State, Rutgers. I think they would have felt I think there was a lot of in a lot of ways, it was a no-win situation for Penn State. And the reality is, as much as Penn State, I think, is a power and is respected in the conference, I do think they are newer blood than Ohio State and Michigan. And they're always, whether fair or not, and I'm not saying it is fair, Ohio State and Michigan are always going to be more protected because they have been the two pillars of the conference for a long, long time. And while Penn State has 30 years in the conference, Ohio State and Penn State have over 100. And so that's just a reality. Now, is it fair? No. Would I have done it this way? Probably not. As a Buckeye fan, I'm just taking my, removing my, Big Ten hat and putting my Ohio State hat on. I actually would have loved to see Ohio State, Penn State be protected. But then even as a Ohio State historian, I would say I think that would also cause problems because if you're going to protect Penn State, I think you've got Illinois, who's also an anchor member in the conference. I think Illinois would be upset because you've got a rivalry game with Illinois where there's actually a trophy, the Battle of Illinois, and that's being disrespected. And while Illinois is not nearly as good as Penn State, Illinois at times has really risen up and been a good program in the Big Ten. Last year they were in the West and obviously made some hay throughout the year. Had a really good defense last year. So Penn State was the enigma in all of this. Like USC came in with UCLA. Rutgers and Maryland came in together. And then every other team was established, and Nebraska and Iowa really hit it off. Part of the reason why they hit it off is because Nebraska hasn't been as good as their blue blood status kind of aims them up to be. And so Nebraska, in a lot of ways, has been on par with Iowa. Well, and actually, no offense to Nebraska fans, they haven't been nearly as good as Iowa. But Nebraska and Iowa seem to fit more culturally and competitively than Penn State does with Nebraska. So all that to say, I understand why they didn't give Penn State a protected rival. I still don't think it was the right move. I might have just said Penn State, Michigan State, just to keep it there. But I don't know. It's tough. So that was one of my first takeaways. I think the other takeaway, just looking at the rest of the teams, looking at the rest of the lineup, it does seem like a lot of the lineups are fairly even. If you look, for instance, at Northwestern, they miss a couple of the premier teams the first year, but they get a lot of the premier teams. So they get Ohio State, USC, and Penn State in 1 year. But then in 2025, they still get Ohio State, but they miss Penn State, they miss USC, they miss UCLA, but they get Michigan, Michigan State, and Wisconsin. And so it seems to be, fairly even. And I think you see throughout the scheduling, no one has a cakewalk schedule, like in terms of the Big Ten teams. Like, again, Nebraska, they get Rutgers, they get Illinois, who, Rutgers and Illinois, Rutgers is like basement at this point in the Big Ten. Illinois, I think they're probably going to regress to being a 6-6 type of team this year. But then you have Ohio State, USC, Minnesota, who I think, again, might be an 8-4, 9-3 caliber team. Maryland has some good talent. Michigan. And so they've got 3 or 4 premier teams, a couple mid teams, and then the weaker teams. And it seems to me like that really is where the scheduling is in terms of breakdown of almost every team and every school. So I think it's good scheduling. It doesn't seem like anyone is really overweighted in terms of competitive struggle, which leads to, I think, a couple of thoughts. One is that this does make life harder for the teams that have been in the West. So if you remember, West teams, they all played each other and then they would rotate. And often, and this was even true the past couple of years, you would look at the teams who didn't play East crossover games with Ohio State, Michigan, and Penn State, and you'd be like, they have the best shot to win the West. And often that was the case. Like if they had the easier crossover schedule, they had Penn State, Maryland, and Rutgers. Well, it's like, or Indiana, Ohio State, and Michigan State. It's like, okay, you have a shot to win because you don't have Ohio State, Michigan, and Maryland, which is two really good teams, and then a mid-tier team in the East. So a lot of the West teams benefited from not having to deal with the East, all of the East powers. Now, all of a sudden, not only do they have to deal with more of the East powers or USC, they also have to deal with the reality that they need the first or second best record in the Big Ten to actually get into the dance, right? You can't go 8-4 anymore and make the Big Ten championship game, right? Just doesn't work. So the West teams, I think this really hurts them. I don't think you're going to see Wisconsin in a Big Ten championship game for a while. Because they don't recruit. They don't recruit as well. Now, Fickle, I think, can do some things about that. But it's still an uphill battle for them to get there because you're dealing with Ohio State and Ryan Day. You're dealing with Michigan and Jim Harbaugh, Penn State and James Franklin, and Lincoln Riley and USC. And so even if you have a good season, and even if your schedule is a little bit more lenient, you've also got to deal with the fact that you've got 4 teams who are recruiting better than you almost every year. And not just recruiting a little better, but significantly better. So I think it hurts the West teams. At the same time, I think it really helps teams like Indiana and Rutgers and Maryland and Michigan State. Because guess what? They don't have to deal with the logjam in front of them. So looking even at the 2024 schedule for Rutgers, they still get, actually looking at Rutgers' schedule, it doesn't help them that much. They get Michigan, Penn State, Michigan State, and Ohio State. But look at Rutgers in 2025. They still get Penn State. That's not a protected game, but they get Penn State twice. But they get USC, and then it's Maryland, Purdue, Wisconsin, Indiana, Nebraska, Northwestern, UCLA. This is not me predicting that Rutgers will go 7-5 in 2025. But if you were to tell me what chance does Rutgers have in 2025 to maybe eke out 3 or 4 wins in the Big Ten, 2025 could be the year. Like they could possibly upset Maryland. They could possibly upset Purdue. They can beat Indiana. They could beat Northwestern. They could possibly beat Nebraska. That's depending on whether if Nebraska doesn't improve under Matt Rule, which I think they will. But Rutgers could get three wins in the Big Ten. They could get bowl eligible because then all they have to do is win, schedule easy in the non-conference. So it helps teams like that. It helps the teams in the East that were stuck behind the log jam of top 10 national teams in the East, right? Maryland, it really helps. It really helps Maryland. And so, again, in 2025, they have a more brutal schedule because they have to deal with Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State. All right, that's not, that's hard. But you look at their 2024 schedule, they get Rutgers, Michigan State, Purdue, USC, and Wisconsin at home. it's possible they go undefeated at home. And I know USC would be the toughest one, and Wisconsin would be tough, but Maryland's got talent. And then their away schedule is Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, and Michigan. Like, could they go 8-1 in the Big Ten and sneak into the Big Ten championship game in 2024? Like, I'm not projecting that. I'm not saying that's true, but it gives a team like Maryland a much better shot in certain years because they don't have to deal with Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, and Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, and Michigan State in the same year when they're all good. Now, USC most likely is going to be really, really good, right? Wisconsin is going to get better under Luke Fickell. But again, it really does help those, I think particularly the Michigan State, Maryland, Rutgers, and Indiana. It helps Indiana and Rutgers to be bowl eligible, like to get to bowl eligibility certain years. I think for Maryland and for Michigan State, it gives them more opportunity to be the dark horse in the conference. So I think that's a big deal. I think the other takeaway in all of this is in some ways you're going to keep some of the tradition that the Big Ten really loves. At the same time, you're gonna get some really fun marquee matchups throughout the next couple years, right? So you're gonna get Michigan at USC in 2024. You're gonna get Michigan hosting UCLA, right? Penn State is gonna host USC. Like, that's crazy. They're gonna host their home schedule. In 2024, they get Michigan State, they get Nebraska, they get, Northwestern. Okay, no offense, Wildcat fans, but they get Ohio State and USC? Like, which one's the whiteout game? Like, traditionally you'd think Ohio State, but man, you get USC at night, their Big Ten debut? Woo! That's fun, man. That's really fun. Ohio State gets to go out to Pasadena for UCLA. That's a fun matchup. And so you're going to get a lot of great matchups, I think, over the next few years. It makes things fresh. You're going to get really great coaching matchups. We talked about this in other podcasts. But ultimately, I look at this schedule, and I think while there are certainly gripes about it, I think it's set up about as well as you can do it. Because it's guaranteeing that every team's going to play each other in the next 4 years. You're getting the two best teams in the Big Ten championship game every year. And it'll have stakes. It will have more stakes than it has in the past, because typically over the past, I think, 10 years of the Big Ten championship game, one team has had playoff implications and the other team is playing spoiler. I think the only year, no, there are 2 years that I think that wasn't the case. I think 2015, when Michigan State and Iowa played in 2015. Those two teams were really playing for a playoff spot. And then in 2017, Ohio State didn't make the playoff, but they had a chance to get in, particularly if they had beaten Wisconsin pretty badly, and Wisconsin would have gotten in if they beat Ohio State. Those are the only 2 years that I can think of since the inception of the Big Ten championship game that there's actually been real stakes for the playoff. And now you're talking about home field advantage, a first round bye, and both teams are probably going to be in the playoff. So which one gets the advantage moving forward? Huge stakes, and you're going to get a much better matchup and which means better ratings, which means more sponsorships, more money, more investment in these programs and athletic departments. So I really like that they've gone away from divisions. I think that's really smart. I think the schedules really make sense. And I think while I think stuff with Penn State, that's probably not going to be fun for Penn State fans to chew on. I do think it is about as fair as you can make it. And it's really guaranteeing, I think, the success of the conference, not just within the conference and conference competition, but I think for the playoff moving forward. So love to hear your thoughts. Leave a review. Let me know what you guys think. I think on Spotify, you might be able to leave comments as well. But yeah, thank you for listening. I'll be taking, again, a couple weeks off here, and then we'll probably start to get more into the swing of things as we hit July. Again, this is the Big Ten Football Talk podcast. Make sure to subscribe on Apple, Google, Spotify. Leave a review. This is Zach Guggenheim, your host, signing off. Take care. God bless.